Chapter 1. The City Carved from Stone. Welcome to this journey through one of the most mysterious chapters in American history. Before we begin, we invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and at what time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach you. Because what we are about to explore today transcends ordinary history. We're traveling back 700 years to a place where an entire civilization, not a small tribe, not a settlement, but tens of thousands of people, vanished from the face of the earth. They left behind their homes, their possessions, their most precious belongings. They abandoned cities carved into stone cliffs, structures of breathtaking sophistication and precision. And no one has ever fully explained why. This is the story of Mesa Verde, the Green Table, a place that challenges everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian American civilization. A place where the mysteries multiply the deeper you dig. A place where archaeologists and historians have spent more than a century searching for answers to a single, haunting question. Where did they go? And perhaps more importantly, why did they leave? Picture it. The year is 1100 AD. High above the Colorado Plateau, in what would one day become the southwestern United States, but which in this era was an untamed wilderness known only to the indigenous peoples who dwelled there. An extraordinary transformation was beginning. In the shadow of towering cliff faces, in alcoves carved by millions of years of water erosion, a civilization was emerging. Not gradually, but with purposeful, deliberate intention. They were building something magnificent. Something that would stand for centuries. Something that would eventually bewilder the world. The region itself is dramatic, almost otherworldly in its beauty. Imagine mesas, vast plateaus of weathered sandstone, rising abruptly from the desert floor, their edges carved by deep, twisting canyons that seem to descend endlessly toward invisible streams far below. The landscape is a study in contrasts, brilliant reds and golds of the rock face, deep shadows in the canyons where water still occasionally runs, and the surprisingly green vegetation that somehow survives in this high desert environment. At elevations between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, the Mesa Verde region receives enough rainfall and maintains enough moisture to support a surprising diversity of life. Junipers and piñon pines, mountain mahogany, desert grasses that turn golden in the autumn sun. To those who lived there, this must have seemed like a promised land, an oasis in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving landscape. The Spanish conquistadors and explorers who arrived in the Southwest centuries later would encounter the descendants of these ancient builders and would name them Pueblo, the villages. But this term, accurate as it might be, fails to capture the sophistication, the complexity, the sheer ambition of what these people had created. And what Mesa Verde represented at its height was not merely a village or even several villages. It was a metropolitan complex, a civilization, a city in the sky. Now consider this carefully. The ancestral Puebloans, who constructed the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, who built the structures we see today, possessed no iron tools. They owned no wheeled vehicles. They had no beasts of burden, no draft animals to aid them in their labor. They did not use pulleys or rope and tackle systems, as the Egyptians did. They built not with modern machinery, but with stone hammers, bone tools, wooden levers, and raw human determination. Yet despite these profound limitations, they created buildings of such precision, such architectural sophistication, that modern engineers and architects studying them today are often astounded by the level of technical knowledge they possessed. Between the years 1100 and 1285 AD, roughly 185 years of building, planning, and construction, the Pueblo peoples transformed the natural landscape of Mesa Verde. They carved dwellings directly into the cliff faces themselves. Picture this. Imagine standing hundreds of feet above the ground on the narrow face of a vertical cliff, working with a stone hammer to shape another stone, carving room after room out of the solid rock itself. This was their reality. Some of the cliff dwellings that survive today contain more than 100 rooms, arranged in geometric patterns of stunning precision, connected by narrow corridors and secret passages, organized according to principles of spatial planning that suggest a sophisticated understanding of architecture and community design. The construction techniques alone reveal remarkable ingenuity. Walls were built using a method called coursed masonry, carefully selected stones, often shaped using stone-on-stone percussion, fitted together in precise rows, and bound with mortar made from locally mined clay and sand mixed to exact proportions. The joints between stones were often no thicker than a quarter inch, suggesting that the builders had developed extremely refined techniques for cutting and fitting stone. The mortar, when analyzed by modern archaeologists, proves to be remarkably durable. Many walls still stand nearly intact 700 years after construction, their mortar joints still holding firm against centuries of weathering. But the sophistication went far beyond simple masonry. These builders developed and implemented complex water management systems. They constructed aqueducts, channels carved into the living rock or built above ground, that channeled water from distant sources, often from springs located miles away, to the cliff dwellings themselves. They built cisterns and reservoirs to capture every drop of precious rainfall. They created agricultural terraces on the mesa top, carefully engineered to capture and retain moisture, allowing them to cultivate crops, maize, beans, and squash in a region that receives less than 20 inches of rain annually. In some places, their field systems remain visible to this day, testament to engineering that was both practical and aesthetically conscious. They also developed a sophisticated road system. These were not simple trails worn by passage, but deliberately engineered roads, some of them wider than modern sidewalks, that connected different communities and different settlement areas across the plateau. In certain locations, these roads were raised slightly above the surrounding terrain, suggesting that the Pueblo peoples understood principles of drainage and water management at a level we might not have expected. In other areas, the roads were marked by low walls or berms of carefully stacked stones, presumably to guide travelers across open terrain and to mark territorial boundaries. The jewel of Mesa Verde civilization was, and remains, Cliff Palace. This structure stands as perhaps the most magnificent example of Pueblo engineering and architectural vision, and its discovery in 1888 sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology and history. Two cowboys named Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason, exploring the canyons of Mesa Verde on a cold December afternoon, came upon it quite by accident. As the afternoon light slanted at a low angle through the canyon, Cliff Palace seemed to materialize out of the shadow and mist, like some lost European fortress. A castle carved from golden sandstone, with towers and turrets rising impossibly from the cliff face, the walls glowing warm in the fading sunlight. When Wetherill and Mason first gazed upon this structure, they were left literally speechless. This couldn't be. How could such a thing exist in the American wilderness? It seemed impossible. It seemed to belong to ancient Greece or Rome, to medieval Europe, not to the American Southwest. And yet there it was, undeniably real. A city carved from stone, hidden within a canyon, preserved for more than 600 years in perfect abandonment, waiting to tell its story to whoever found it. Cliff Palace is monumental not just in size, but in complexity. The structure contains approximately 150 rooms, along with 23 ceremonial chambers called kivas. This complex was home to roughly 125 people during its peak period of habitation. But numbers alone do not capture what makes this structure extraordinary. Every aspect of Cliff Palace's design reflects careful planning and deep understanding of architecture. The entire complex is built within a massive natural alcove in the cliff face, a depression in the rock created over millions of years by water erosion. But rather than simply filling this space with rooms, the Pueblo architects worked within and around the natural features, using the existing cave ceiling as the roof for some structures, creating an elegant integration of natural landscape and human construction. The rooms are arranged in a curved line following the shape of the alcove, maximizing the use of available space and creating a unified, organic design. The central plaza sits at ground level, bordered on multiple sides by the multi-story structures that rise like the tiers of an ancient amphitheater. The kivas, those circular ceremonial chambers, are perhaps the most carefully engineered structures within Cliff Palace. Built partially underground, partially above, these chambers are perfectly proportioned according to mathematical principles. The diameter and depth follow specific ratios that create near-perfect acoustics. Channels are carved into the stone floor to direct airflow. Small openings in the walls allow smoke from ceremonial fires to escape without allowing rain to enter. The precision of these features, repeated in kiva after kiva across the mesa, suggests not mere luck or accident, but deliberate, transmitted knowledge. These people understood acoustics. They understood ventilation. They understood materials and how they behaved. Water channels are carved into the very stone of the walls, directing rainfall into collection areas. Storage rooms are positioned at specific locations that maintain relatively constant temperatures throughout the year, ideal for preserving food. Observation points are oriented towards specific astronomical events. When you stand within Cliff Palace today, what strikes you most forcefully is the sense that every decision made in its construction reflected careful thought. These were not haphazard builders. These were people who understood their world and their building materials with sophisticated precision. The era from approximately 1150 AD to 1280 AD represents the height of Mesa Verde civilization. During this roughly 130-year period, the region experienced its greatest population growth and architectural development. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population swelled to somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people scattered across the mesa and surrounding regions. To put this in perspective, that population density was comparable to medieval European cities of the same period. Not comparable in absolute numbers, but in terms of people per square mile of inhabitable land. This was not a scattered collection of primitive settlements. This was a civilization. The size of these numbers makes certain conclusions inescapable. You cannot build structures like Cliff Palace or the hundreds of other cliff dwellings found across the mesa without organized labor. Someone had to plan. Someone had to organize. Someone had to coordinate the work of hundreds of people over years of construction. This implies a hierarchical social structure. This implies leaders and followers. This implies specialization of labor. Some people farmed. Some people were master masons. Their skills honed over years, perhaps taught from father to son or master to apprentice. Some people were artisans, not mere potters, but artists who created decorated ceramics of profound beauty. Some people were likely priests, administrators, traders. Some people may have been sculptors, musicians, or weavers. This was not an egalitarian community of simple farmers. This was a society with complexity, with hierarchy, with sophisticated divisions of labor. The pottery produced at Mesa Verde during this period is startlingly beautiful. Black on white designs, geometric patterns of mathematical precision, symbols of complex meaning decorating every vessel. Some pieces contain hundreds of individual design elements, each one requiring careful placement and execution. The skill required to create such work suggests training, practice, specialization. These were not casual domestic productions. These were works of art. Trade routes connected Mesa Verde to distant regions. Artifacts recovered during excavations include shells from the Pacific coast, copper from Mexico, pottery styles that originated in the Rio Grande Valley, hundreds of miles away. This evidence of trade suggests that Mesa Verde peoples had contact with neighboring civilizations, that they participated in regional commerce and exchange networks. They were not isolated. They were connected. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of agricultural innovation as well. The Pueblo peoples studied the landscape, understood where water collected, where the soil was richest, where weather patterns created microclimates favorable to cultivation. They engineered their fields accordingly. They built check dams and terraces. They created mulching systems to reduce water loss through evaporation. They grew crops in a region where agriculture should have been nearly impossible. Yet they not only survived, they thrived. Their population grew. Their civilization expanded. But prosperity, as history so often demonstrates, does not guarantee stability. Around 1250 AD, roughly 30 to 35 years before the complete abandonment of Mesa Verde, something changed. The archaeological record shows evidence of increasingly unusual preparations and modifications to the settlement. New walls were constructed in certain locations, walls that seemed to serve defensive rather than purely structural purposes. Existing buildings were mysteriously sealed, their doorways blocked, their windows closed off. In some cases, kivas were deliberately filled with rubble and earth, their sacred spaces desecrated or repurposed. New constructions began to display defensive characteristics. Structures were built in more defensible positions, on promontories or at the edges of canyons, where they could not be easily approached. Settlements that had previously been spread across open plateaus were moved into more protected locations. Watchtowers appeared in certain areas. Walls that could be interpreted as defensive fortifications began to appear. What had been a peaceful, prospering civilization seemed to be preparing for something. Preparing for conflict, preparing for siege. The transformation in architecture suggests a fundamental shift in the people's sense of security and safety. Evidence suggests increased conflict during this period, not just within Mesa Verde, but in the broader region. Skeletal remains discovered during excavations show evidence of violence, fractures consistent with weapon strikes, evidence of warfare injuries. In some settlements, layers of ash and charred wood suggest burning, possibly from attacks. The Pueblo peoples of Mesa Verde were not suffering from some sudden external catastrophe that forced their abandonment. Rather, something was changing in their world. Something was making them increasingly anxious about their safety. The silence. By 1280 AD, construction had ceased. No new buildings were begun. No repairs were made to aging structures. The constant daily activity that must have characterized Mesa Verde for nearly 2 centuries, the sounds of hammers striking stone, the voices of workers calling out, the daily bustle and commerce of a living civilization, fell silent. Not gradually, but seemingly all at once. The fields were abandoned. The kivas were no longer lit with ceremonial fires. The homes were left not in ruins, but in a state of perfect, almost eerie abandonment. When archaeologists finally entered these empty rooms centuries later, they found evidence of this sudden departure. Pottery sat on shelves, suggesting that people had left so quickly they didn't bother collecting their dishware. Corn was left in storage bins, food left behind, suggesting not a planned migration, but something more urgent. Tools lay where they had been dropped, half-completed projects abandoned mid-task. In some homes, researchers found evidence suggesting that personal items had been hastily packed. In others, it appeared that people had fled with only what they could carry, leaving behind the accumulated material possessions of generations. By 1300 AD, 13 years after the last identifiable occupations, Mesa Verde was completely empty. Not a single permanent settlement remained inhabited. 50,000 people had vanished from the landscape. Not a trace, not a sign. They took what they could carry, left their cities to the elements, and disappeared into history. The question that would puzzle historians and archaeologists for more than 600 years suddenly became crystalline in its importance. Not how did they build this magnificent civilization, but rather why did they abandon it? What was so terrible, so overwhelming, that an entire people decided their most magnificent achievement, their cities, their homes, their sacred places, could no longer sustain them? This is where our journey truly begins. We stand at the threshold of one of North America's greatest unsolved mysteries. A civilization that mastered the high desert, that created architecture of astonishing sophistication, that built cities that still stand nearly intact 7 centuries after abandonment, decided that they could no longer remain. The very people who had engineered their environment to support thousands decided to walk away from everything they had built. What drove them to that decision? What threat was so serious that abandonment seemed preferable to resistance? What had changed in their world? What had changed in their sky, their soil, their climate? What had changed in their social structures that made their great cities suddenly untenable? The answers to these questions lie not just in archaeological investigation and scientific study, but in the physical environment itself, in the climate records preserved in tree rings and ice cores, in the mysterious final preparations made within abandoned rooms, and in the desperate act of departure itself. An act that would remain unexplained for more than 600 years. In our next chapter, we will explore Mesa Verde civilization at the height of its power. The year 1200 AD, when these cities were thriving, when their population was at its peak, when everything seemed to suggest a civilization that would endure for centuries. We will examine what life was like during that golden moment, and we will discover the hidden signs, the subtle warnings that catastrophe was approaching. Signs that, when viewed through the lens of modern science, tell us much about what was to come. Chapter 2, 1200 AD, the Golden Year. We left you standing at the edge of mystery, a civilization that carved impossible cities from stone, then simply walked away, abandoned everything, left their homes intact, their food in storage bins, their most precious possessions behind. But before we understand the why, before we explore the catastrophe that would shatter their world, we need to understand what they had built. We need to stand in those cities when they were alive, when smoke rose from ceremonial fires, when children's voices echoed through the plazas, when the future seemed not just bright, but inevitable. This is the year 1200 AD. This is the moment before the fall. Picture this. You are traveling south from the Rio Grande Valley, following trading routes your people have used for generations. The landscape around you is changing, the river valleys giving way to higher elevations, the vegetation shifting from cottonwoods and willows to piñon pine and juniper. You have been traveling for weeks. Your feet are calloused, your lips are cracked from the dry air. But ahead, you see it, the dark line of canyons that mark the Mesa Verde region. As you approach, you notice something peculiar. The landscape is not empty wilderness. There are signs of human presence everywhere. Small agricultural fields terraced carefully into hillsides. Each step designed with mathematical precision to catch and hold water. Stone cairns marking the path, placed strategically, so that even at dusk, a traveler can follow the road. Hunting blinds constructed from stacked stone at a particular ridge, a location where, at certain times of year, the deer pass. Someone has studied this landscape. Someone understands it. You descend into the canyon, following the marked trail. The canyon walls rise around you, rust-red sandstone glowing in the afternoon light. As you descend deeper, the air cools. You can smell water, not a river, but moisture in the air, suggesting seepage from the rocks. Vegetation becomes slightly more lush. Junipers grow thicker. You see cottonwoods, suggesting more reliable moisture than on the mesa top. Then you hear it. Voices. Dozens of voices. Maybe more. The sound of human activity. You round a bend in the canyon, and suddenly, the world opens before you. You stop. You cannot help but stop, because what you see seems impossible. Rising from the canyon floor, built directly into the cliff face, is a city, not a settlement, not a collection of crude dwellings. A city, multi-story structures of golden sandstone, their walls rising 40, 50, sometimes 60 feet above the canyon floor. Towers and turrets, hundreds of windows, each precisely positioned. Courtyards and plazas, some at ground level, others elevated. And the whole structure seems to flow with the contours of the cliff, as if the builders had worked with the rock itself, incorporating natural alcoves and crevices into their design. This is Cliff Palace. This is the heart of Mesa Verde civilization in 1200 AD. As you approach closer, the sounds intensify. You can hear women's voices, singing, high melodic sounds that echo off the stone walls. The smell of cooking fires reaches you, corn being roasted, beans being prepared with herbs. Children are playing somewhere, their laughter creating a complex acoustic pattern as it bounces between canyon walls. Underneath it all, the sound of work, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of stone hammers, the scrape of tools on rock, the creak of wooden scaffolding. You see now that there are people everywhere. On the rooftops of the ground floor structures, people are working. Some are repairing walls. Some are laying out pottery to dry in the sun. A woman sits in the corner of a rooftop, working a loom, her hands moving in a rhythm so practiced it appears almost automatic. The fabric she is creating is stunning. Geometric patterns in red, black, and white. Below her, in a shaded area beneath the overhang of a higher structure, other women are working clay. You can see the pottery, dozens of vessels in various stages of completion. Some are being shaped, still soft. Some are being painted with meticulous designs. Some are stacked, presumably ready for firing. The air is thick with activity and purpose. This is not chaos, but organized complexity. Everyone seems to know what they're doing. Everyone has a role. Young men are carrying large ceramic vessels of water, carefully, slowly, distributing them to work areas. An older man, probably a master mason, is directing 3 younger men in the construction of a new wall. He points, gestures, occasionally reaches out to adjust the positioning of a stone. His authority is clear, but it is not harsh. It is the authority of knowledge, of skill, of experience. The younger men listen. They adjust their work according to his direction. They respect him. You are allowed to enter the central plaza. This area is perhaps 100 feet across, surrounded on multiple sides by the residential and ceremonial structures. The ground is packed earth, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. At the edges of the plaza, you see the entrances to circular structures built partially underground. These are the kivas, the ceremonial chambers. Several have smoke rising from openings in their roofs. Even in the afternoon, fires are burning within. In one corner of the plaza, you see something extraordinary. A group of teenagers, perhaps 12 or 13 of them, are being led by an older man into one of the kivas. This is an initiation ceremony. You understand this from the ritual context, the careful way the elders have organized this. These young people are being brought into a deeper understanding of their community's spiritual life. You catch glimpses of masked figures within, kachinas, spiritual beings, wearing elaborate costumes of feathers, fur, and painted wood. The sounds coming from the kiva are hypnotic. Drums chanting, the voices of the spirit beings themselves. A child watching from the plaza edges grips their mother's hand, eyes wide with a combination of fear and fascination. Near another kiva entrance, you see something that stops you cold. A hole in the ground, deliberately created, circular in shape. This is a sipapu, the emergence place. According to Pueblo cosmology, this represents the place through which the ancestral peoples emerged into this world. It is considered profoundly sacred. Only those with spiritual training touch it. Only during certain ceremonies is it even acknowledged. The fact that it is here, openly visible, suggests the spiritual sophistication of this place. This is not a society that hides its sacred spaces. This is a society confident enough in its spiritual knowledge to display the symbols of that knowledge openly. But what astounds you most is something that should seem mundane but is actually extraordinary. Water. There is water here. In the middle of a desert where rain is scarce, where water sources are limited, there is running water. You follow the sound and discover a series of channels carved into the stone itself. Water flows from a higher elevation, carefully directed downward through precise channels that have been cut with remarkable accuracy. The water is cold. You taste it and find it clean, pure, carrying minerals from underground springs. An older woman sees your wonder and explains, as a mother might explain something to a child. She points to the cliff face above. There, she says, indicating a location perhaps 300 feet up the canyon wall. Springs. places where water emerges from the rock. Our grandfathers learned where these springs are. They built channels, look, you can see them, that carry the water down to us. In winter, when frost cracking breaks the rock, the channels freeze, but the water still flows through them. In summer, when rain comes to the mesa top, more water flows. We have learned to capture it all. She shows you a series of cisterns, natural depressions in the rock that have been carefully enlarged and sealed with stonework. Each cistern is designed to capture and hold water. When the rains come, she explains, the fields on the mesa top flood with water. Our engineers have built terraces to slow that water, to make it sink into the soil. But some runs off. That runoff comes down the canyon. We capture it here. She points to a series of channels that direct seasonal runoff into the cisterns. This water is our insurance. If drought comes, and sometimes drought does come, we have stored water. We have lived through 3 summers of poor rains, and we did not suffer because of these cisterns. This simple fact, the presence of available water in an arid region, is perhaps the most profound advantage of Mesa Verde. It is not an accident that the city is built where it is. It is the result of deep understanding. Someone generations ago recognized that water could be reliably accessed at this location. Someone understood how to capture it, how to channel it, how to store it. That knowledge, transmitted across generations, has made Mesa Verde possible. The woman invites you to climb to the mesa top, to see the agricultural lands. The climb is steep. You use hand and foot holds cut into the stone, probably deliberately widened by centuries of passage. Your heart pounds as you reach the top, but when you emerge onto the mesa top and look around, the effort is immediately worth it. Spread before you is an extraordinary landscape of engineered agriculture. What you are seeing is not random farming, but sophisticated land management on a massive scale. The mesa top is covered with fields, but these are not the flat, regular fields of later agricultural societies. These are terraced fields built along the contours of the land. Each terrace is a level surface, held in place by carefully constructed stone walls. Between the terraces, water flows during the rainy season, slowing its descent, allowing it to soak into the soil rather than running off rapidly downslope. The woman points out specific features. Look, those are check dams. Small walls built perpendicular to the slope. They slow water flow even further, create small basins where water accumulates before soaking in. She points to areas where straw or dried plant material has been spread over the soil. Mulch. We gather this in late summer. We spread it over the planted areas. It reduces water loss from evaporation, perhaps by 1/4 or more. In a year of low rainfall, this difference means survival. She shows you different fields planted with different crops. In one area, corn stands waist-high, tassels beginning to form. In another area, beans grow on trellises, vines climbing toward the sun. In a third area, squash sprawls across the ground, large leaves providing shade to smaller plants below. Different crops, different needs, she explains. The beans, the nitrogen in the soil benefits them. After beans, we plant corn, which demands more nitrogen. We rotate the crops. It is like dancing. Each partner moves, then the other, then they work together. The land stays fertile. It produces. You ask about water in the fields. She gestures broadly. Water is scarce. Every drop must be managed. The check dams slow it. The terraces hold it. The mulch preserves it. And she points to channels you now notice, running between the terraced areas. We direct every bit of runoff we can capture toward the fields. Nothing is wasted. As you stand on the mesa top, looking out at this engineered landscape, you begin to understand something fundamental. The Pueblo peoples have not conquered their environment through force or domination. Rather, they have learned to work with it. They have studied water patterns, soil types, seasonal variations. They have adjusted their techniques to match the landscape. They have created a harmony between human needs and environmental constraints. The result is agriculture that should not be possible in an arid region. Yet here it is, producing abundance. That evening, you are invited to witness a ceremony in one of the kivas. The entrance is a simple opening, with a wooden ladder extending downward into the darkness. You descend, your eyes adjusting to the dim light. At the bottom, you step into a circular chamber perhaps 40 feet in diameter. The ceiling is perhaps 15 feet above your head. The walls are made of precisely fitted stone, and everything is decorated. Geometric designs in red, yellow, black, and white cover the walls. Symbols you do not understand, but which clearly communicate meaning to the Pueblo peoples, are painted at specific locations. You can see smoke rising from a central hearth fire. The smoke is drawn upward through a carefully positioned opening in the roof. The air circulation is perfect, warm but not stifling, with the smoke efficiently drawn away. Benches run along the interior walls, and people sit on them, perhaps 50 people filling the kiva. An elderly man stands near the central fire. He begins to sing, and his voice, deep, resonant, fills the chamber. The acoustics are extraordinary. His voice seems to come from the stone itself, as if the kiva itself is singing. Others join in, their voices harmonizing, creating layers of sound that are hypnotic, almost trance-inducing. Then, the kachinas emerge. These are masked figures, perhaps 8 feet tall with elaborate headdresses, representing spiritual beings. They dance, and their movements are precise, practiced, powerful. They are not entertainment. They are prayer in motion. They are communication with the spiritual realm. The drumming accelerates. The chanting becomes more intense. The dancers move faster. And you feel it. A sense that something sacred is happening. That the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world is thin here. That in this moment, in this kiva, beneath the earth, the Pueblo peoples are connecting with forces that sustain their world. The next morning, a commotion draws your attention to the canyon entrance. Traders have arrived from the south. You watch as they descend into the canyon, leading pack animals carrying goods from hundreds of miles away. Shell beads from the Pacific coast, pale, lustrous, beautiful. Copper items from Mexico, bells, bracelets, ornaments. The traders wear clothing decorated with these exotic items. They carry themselves with confidence and authority. These are people accustomed to traveling, to conducting business, to moving between different worlds. The marketplace that develops is chaotic and fascinating. Pueblo potters display their work, black on white pieces of stunning beauty and technical perfection. The traders examine them carefully, handling them delicately, assessing their value. Negotiations take place in a mixture of languages, with hand gestures filling gaps in communication. You see specific pieces commanding high prices. Certain potters appear to have high status. Their goods are purchased first, their prices accepted without negotiation. An older trader pulls you aside. He speaks in careful Spanish-influenced words, along with hand signs. Mesa Verde pottery, he says, gesturing at the pieces. Best in the north, From here, it travels. We take it to the Rio Grande. We trade it further south. It reaches my people, reaches lands you have never heard of, your potters. He points to a woman whose pieces have been particularly sought after. She is famous. Her work is recognized even in the South. When I bring her pottery, people know it is from here. It brings prestige. It brings good prices. He shows you shells from the Pacific, now being sold or traded in Mesa Verde. Water, many days to the west. Water that goes on forever. In that water, these shells grow. We gather them. We bring them here. You cannot find shells here, yes? We bring you the ocean. In exchange, we take your pottery. Everyone profits. Everyone benefits. For the first time, you understand. Mesa Verde is not isolated. It is connected to a vast network of trade that spans hundreds of miles. Goods flow in from the Pacific, from Mexico, from the Rio Grande. Goods flow out, pottery primarily, but perhaps other items you are not yet aware of. People who have traveled these trade routes bring back knowledge. They understand the wider world. They know how other peoples live, what they value, how they organize themselves. This knowledge flows into Mesa Verde, shaping how the Pueblo peoples think and organize their own society. As you prepare to leave Mesa Verde after weeks of observation and participation, you sense something. It is not explicit, but it permeates the community. Confidence, certainty, a sense that the world is moving in the right direction. The population is growing. You have observed families with multiple children. The construction continues. New rooms are being added to existing structures. The agricultural fields are producing abundance. The trade networks are bringing wealth. The spiritual life is vibrant and well-maintained. The people of 1200 AD have never known true hardship. Yes, there are stories of earlier times of droughts and difficulties, but these are history lessons. The people of 1200 AD have grown up in times of adequate rainfall and successful harvests. The cliff dwellings are complete and comfortable. The water systems are functioning perfectly. The carefully engineered fields are producing corn, beans, and squash in abundance. Storerooms are full of dried crops, enough to sustain the population for several years if necessary. Young children who are born in 1200 AD will grow up believing that this is how the world works. This is normal. Abundance is normal. Successful crops are normal. Water is available. The cities are thriving. The ceremonies are effective. The gods are beneficent. Life is good. But something is shifting. You cannot see it yet. It is subtle. It is hidden in the rings of trees, yet to be formed. It is hidden in the atmospheric patterns, not yet changing. It is hidden in the climate cycles that operate on timescales of decades. But it is there. The shift is beginning. In the conversations you overhear in the kivas and plazas, certain themes emerge. Elders mention weather patterns. The rains came later this year than they did 5 years ago. Did you notice? Yes. The crops started growing later. We may finish harvest slightly later as well. These are casual observations, shared without alarm, but they suggest attention. They suggest that the people are monitoring environmental conditions. You hear discussions about water storage. We filled the cisterns completely this year. The springs were generous. We should prepare for a year when they are not so generous. Again, this is forward-thinking, responsible planning. But it also suggests that the Pueblo peoples understand that variation exists, that favorable conditions cannot be taken for granted. An astronomy specialist, a man responsible for maintaining the ritual calendar and understanding celestial events, mentions something that you initially don't understand. The year cycles, he says. Some cycles are good. Some cycles are difficult. We are entering a new cycle. I do not yet understand if this cycle will favor us or challenge us. We must watch carefully. These conversations are not alarmed. They are matter-of-fact, professional discussions among people experienced in reading environmental signs. But they represent a subtle awareness that conditions are changing, that the era of consistent abundance may not be permanent. And in the fields on the mesa top, you notice something else. In areas where the water flow has been particularly reliable, check dams and terraces are being reinforced and expanded. New storage cisterns are being constructed. New channels are being carved to direct water flow. It is as if the engineers of Mesa Verde are anticipating that water management will become more critical, more challenging. These are not signs of crisis. There is no alarm, no panic. But they are signs of a civilization beginning to sense that the stable, abundant world in which they have lived may be entering a new phase. As you leave Mesa Verde and climb out of the canyon, you look back one last time at Cliff Palace glowing in the afternoon sunlight. The smoke from cooking fires rises into the still air. You can hear the distant sound of voices, the rhythmic tap of stone hammers. The city is alive, it is thriving, it is, in this moment in 1200 AD, one of the most sophisticated and successful civilizations in North America. But you are leaving with a strange feeling, a sense that you have witnessed something at a particular moment in time. A moment of peak, a moment before something shifts. A moment of confidence that, though the people inside the city cannot see it, is already being undermined by forces beyond anyone's control. The next 80 years will test everything the Pueblo peoples have built. The climate will shift. Water will become scarcer. Pressure will mount. Choices will become difficult. And eventually, choices that seem unthinkable in 1200 AD. Abandoning these magnificent cities, leaving behind generations of work and achievement, will come to seem like the only possible option. But that story, that tragedy, is yet to come. For now, you leave Mesa Verde as it is in 1200 AD, thriving, confident, secure in the knowledge of its achievements and its future. A future that will never come to pass. Chapter 3. Strange signs from the sky. 30 years have passed since we stood with you in 1200 AD. 30 years of watching. 30 years of subtle changes accumulating, layering one upon another like deposits of sediment, building into something more significant. We are now in 1230 AD, and if you were to return to Mesa Verde, you might notice that nothing dramatic has changed. The cities are still populated, the ceremonies still happen, the fields still produce crops. On the surface, everything appears normal, but beneath the surface, something is shifting. Something is changing in ways that are not yet obvious to those experiencing them, but which will become increasingly undeniable. This is the beginning of the end. Not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, inexorable process of environmental deterioration. This is the story of how a civilization begins to realize that the world they have understood, the patterns they have relied upon, are no longer reliable. This is the story of climate change, medieval style. An astronomy specialist stands on the mesa top at dawn, watching the sun rise above the eastern horizon. His name is lost to history, but his role was crucial. He was a keeper of calendars, an observer of celestial cycles, a man responsible for maintaining the ritual calendar and ensuring that ceremonies happened at the right time. This particular dawn, in the year 1230 AD, he notices something subtle but troubling. The sun is rising at a position slightly different than it should, not dramatically different. The change is measured in degrees, in the width of perhaps 3 fingers when you hold your hand at arm's length. But it is different. He has watched the sun rise at this location for 30 years. He knows the position precisely. He makes careful marks on the rocks, marks that indicate where the sun should rise at different times of year. This sunrise does not align with his marks. He returns to the kiva where records are kept. Not written records in the modern sense, but physical markers, knotted strings, carefully arranged stones. He consults with other specialists, men whose job it is to maintain the calendar and observe celestial events. Discussions become more animated. Disagreements emerge. One possibility is terrifying. The calendar itself is somehow wrong. The celestial cycles that had been so reliable, so predictable, have shifted. But a younger specialist suggests something else. Perhaps the calendar is fine. Perhaps the sun is not changing, but something else is. Perhaps something in the atmosphere is affecting how we perceive the sun. Perhaps the air itself is changing. They cannot resolve the discrepancy, but they record it carefully. They make notes. They document the anomaly. Because in a society where the calendar is sacred, where ceremonies must happen at precisely the right time, where the relationship between human activity and celestial cycles is fundamental to survival, any shift in the celestial patterns is profoundly disturbing. Meanwhile, on the mesa top, farmers are noticing something else. The spring rains are late. Not catastrophically late, perhaps only a few weeks, but noticeable. The farmers know the cycles of weather intimately. They have studied them for generations. They know when rains typically begin. They understand the patterns. And this year, the pattern is broken. One farmer, a man named perhaps Corn That Grows Tall by his people, his actual name is lost, stands in a field that should be planted, but is not yet. The soil is too dry. Seeds planted in dry soil will not germinate. They will sit dormant. And if rain does not come, they will eventually rot in the ground. Corn That Grows Tall waits. He waits for the rains. He waits for the storms that should come from the west, bringing moisture from the distant oceans, moisture that nourishes the fields. He waits, and waits, and waits. Finally, in late May, rains begin to come. The planting begins. But the delay is significant. The growing season has been compressed. The plants will have less time to mature before the first autumn frosts arrive. This year's harvest will be smaller. Corn That Grows Tall knows this with certainty, even as the seeds are being placed in the ground. He discusses this with other farmers, and they all report the same pattern. The rains came later. The planting was delayed. The season is shortened. And while the rains, when they finally come, are adequate, the compressed growing season means reduced yields. What happens next is perhaps more troubling than an outright catastrophe would be. Because what unfolds over the next decade is not a single clear crisis, but a pattern of increasing variability. Some years the rains come at the right time, and crops are adequate, if not abundant. Other years the rains are delayed, and crops are reduced. Other years the rains come, but they are lighter than usual, leaving the soil drier than normal. Other years precipitation is actually adequate, but temperatures are higher than usual, increasing evaporation rates, requiring more water to produce the same crops. The water specialists who manage the cisterns and springs begin to notice something alarming. The water flow from the mountain springs is decreasing, not dramatically, but noticeably. The springs that once flowed reliably year-round are now sometimes drying up, in summer. The cisterns, which were designed to hold 2 or 3 years' worth of water, are being drawn down more rapidly now as water reserves are used to supplement the declining springs. A specialist carefully measures the depth of water in the cisterns. He makes marks on the stones indicating the water level. He returns a month later and measures again. The water level has dropped more than it should have for that season. He consults records of previous years, carved into other stones at other cisterns. The pattern is clear. Water reserves are being depleted faster than they are being replenished. Discussions become serious. Elders meet in kivas. They contemplate difficult questions. Is this temporary? Will normal patterns return? Or is something more fundamental changing? The water specialists make recommendations. Be more careful with water use. Reduce watering of crops in the fields. Ensure that priority is given to human consumption. Begin planning for reduced water availability. As resources become tighter, tensions begin to emerge. Not yet open conflict, but tensions nonetheless. In times of plenty, resources are abundant enough that everyone can have adequate portions. In times of scarcity, choices must be made. Who gets what? How are resources distributed? Previously, these questions had obvious answers. Now they become more complex. A young man argues with an elder about access to water. My family has less water than the family living in the eastern quadrant, the young man protests. Why should they have more when we have the same number of people to support? The elder responds with patience but firmness. The family in the eastern quadrant manages the eastern water channel. It is their responsibility to maintain it, to ensure it works properly. If the water channel fails, everyone suffers, so they receive a slightly larger share. This is how it has always been. But we are thirsty, the young man says. My sister is thirsty. Water is available. Why can we not have more? The elder struggles to explain what, in previous years of plenty, would have been unnecessary to discuss. The concept of sustainability, of planning for future shortages, of accepting limitations for the common good. But in the conversation, you can hear the strain. In previous years, this conversation would not have occurred. There was enough for everyone. Now questions of fairness and distribution are beginning to surface. But the environmental challenges are not limited to water. As the climate shifts toward warmer, drier conditions, other problems emerge. Forests begin to experience stress. The piñón pines that grow on the mesa are adapted to the historic climate, but the new climate conditions, higher temperatures, lower rainfall, longer dry seasons, push them beyond their tolerance limits. Trees begin to die. A woodworker, responsible for obtaining the large timbers needed for construction, travels to the forest areas that have always been reliable sources of suitable wood. What he finds disturbs him deeply. Entire sections of forest that were thriving just years before are now dead or dying. The trees are stressed. Many are turning brown, their needles dropping. The bark is being stripped by beetles, pests that, in normal conditions, are controlled by the regular freezing and killing of insect populations during cold winters. But if winters are becoming warmer, beetles can survive through the winter season. Their populations explode. They attack stressed trees, further weakening them. The woodworker returns to the city with troubling news. The forests are failing, he reports to the community leaders. The trees are dying. We may not be able to obtain the large timbers we need for construction. We may not be able to repair existing structures when they fail. This report sends shocks through the society. Construction, particularly the maintenance and expansion of the cliff dwellings, had been an ongoing process. But if timber becomes unavailable, construction will stop. Building projects will stall. The ability to expand and accommodate the growing population will be severely compromised. Unbeknownst to the people of Mesa Verde, the story of these climate changes is being recorded in the wood of the very trees that are beginning to fail. Each year, trees grow by producing a new ring of wood. The width of that ring is directly related to how much moisture was available during that growing season. In wet years, trees produce thick rings. In dry years, trees produce thin rings. By the year 2000 AD, scientists studying tree rings from the Mesa Verde region will reconstruct the climate patterns of the past 2,000 years with remarkable precision. And what they will discover is this. Beginning in 1230 AD, the tree ring widths begin to narrow. Not dramatically at first, but noticeably. This narrowing, repeated year after year in tree after tree, documents the beginning of a prolonged period of reduced precipitation. What the people of Mesa Verde are experiencing as isolated years of lower rainfall is actually the beginning of a multi-decade decline in moisture availability. But they do not know this. They cannot see tree rings documenting the future. They only know what they observe. The rains are less reliable, water is less available, forests are failing. And they respond the way humans always respond to environmental stress. They try to adapt. They modify their practices. They try to engineer solutions. They try to persevere. The water specialists, the engineers who designed the original water management systems, now work on modifications and expansions. If the springs are producing less water, perhaps we can dig deeper, find more reliable springs. Perhaps we can build more cisterns to capture more of the seasonal runoff. Perhaps we can expand the channel system to capture water from greater distances. Large-scale projects are undertaken. New channels are carved, directing water from springs located farther away. New cisterns are excavated. The labor is extensive. Dozens of people work for weeks on these projects. And the results are mixed. Some additional water is captured, but the additional water is less than hoped. It becomes clear that the problem cannot be engineered away. Agricultural engineers also try modifications. If rainfall is less reliable, perhaps we can use the stored water reserves to irrigate the fields. Perhaps we can expand the agricultural terraces and check dam systems to capture more runoff. Perhaps we can shift to drought-tolerant crops, reducing the amount of water required. These experiments are undertaken. Some prove helpful. The agricultural systems become more efficient. Crop yields improve slightly, even in years with lower rainfall. But the fundamental problem remains. Water is becoming scarcer, and the population, which has been growing for generations, continues to require the same resources. This last point is crucial. Mesa Verde's population, which had grown steadily from perhaps 5,000 people in 1100 AD to perhaps 30,000 by 1230 AD, represents not just success, but also vulnerability. A large population requires substantial resources. Every additional person consumes water, requires food, needs shelter. In times of plenty, a growing population is a good thing. It represents strength and vitality. In times of scarcity, a growing population becomes a liability. The community leaders begin to recognize this. Population growth has slowed somewhat, but it has not stopped. There are still more children than in previous generations. People are still living longer on average because conditions have been favorable. The result is a population that is both larger and increasingly composed of people, children, and the elderly, who are most vulnerable to hardship. Elders discuss the situation in the kivas, in hushed tones at first, then with increasing directness. "We have too many people," one elder says. "We cannot support this many people if the water continues to decline." "We cannot control births," another elder responds. "Women have children. This is how the world works. We cannot tell them not to have children." "Then what do we do?" the first elder asks. "Do we accept that some will starve? Do we accept that the young and old will suffer first, as always happens in times of scarcity?" The questions hang in the air. There are no comfortable answers. What happens over the next decade is not a single dramatic event, but a series of challenges that accumulate. Crop yields remain lower than the historic high point of 1200 AD. Water reserves are drawn down more rapidly than they are replenished. Forests continue to decline, making timber increasingly scarce. Conflicts over resource distribution become more frequent. In 1247 AD, a particularly severe drought year, stored corn reserves are drawn upon significantly to supplement inadequate harvests. The cisterns reach levels of water that trigger alarms among the specialists. Emergency meetings are held. Plans are discussed for how to respond if the situation worsens. Then, in 1248 AD, adequate rains return, and there is a collective sigh of relief. Perhaps people think the crisis has passed. Perhaps conditions will return to the abundant times. Stored reserves are replenished. Hopes rise. The emergency response mechanisms are stands down. People return to their normal patterns of living. But in 1249 and 1250, drought returns. Once again, harvests are poor. Once again, stored reserves must be drawn upon. Once again, water becomes a subject of serious concern. And this time, the relief is less visible. The stored reserves, having been partially replenished, are being drawn down again. Water is rationed more carefully. People begin to ask questions that would have seemed unthinkable a generation before. "Should we leave?" a young mother asks her husband. "Should we try to relocate to a place with more reliable water?" "Leave?" her husband responds, surprised by the suggestion. "This is our home. Our ancestors built these cities. We cannot abandon them. But if we have no water, if our children are thirsty, what good is the home?" the mother asks. The husband has no ready answer. The question, though shocking in its implication, reflects a growing recognition that something fundamental may have changed. The spiritual leaders of Mesa Verde, the priests and shamans responsible for maintaining the relationship between the human community and the spiritual realm, are feeling serious concerns. The ceremonies, conducted with the same rituals and precision as they had been for generations, do not seem to be producing the expected results. The rains do not come when called. The crops do not flourish despite the prayers. The water does not flow reliably despite the rituals. This creates a crisis of faith. If the ceremonies were correct, if the spiritual practices were sound, should not the results follow? Some priests suggest that the community must be failing in its spiritual obligations. Perhaps some people are not following the rules. Perhaps some ceremonies are not being conducted properly. Perhaps there is some breach in the spiritual relationship that is causing the gods or spirits to withhold their blessings. This suggestion leads to increased religious fervor. Ceremonies become more elaborate and more frequent. Kachina dances occur more often. Prayer sticks are created in greater quantities. Young people are initiated into deeper spiritual mysteries at younger ages. The spiritual calendar becomes more complex, more demanding. For some, this spiritual intensification is comforting. It provides a sense of agency, a feeling that something is being done to address the crisis. For others, it creates additional stress. The ceremonies require resources. Food must be set aside for ceremonial purposes. People must take time from their work to participate. And yet, the rains do not come. A few voices begin to suggest something almost heretical. Perhaps the spirits are not listening. Perhaps the old ceremonies are no longer working. Perhaps the world has changed in ways that the old spiritual knowledge cannot address. These voices are quiet at first, but they exist. And they reflect a growing doubt that had been unthinkable just a generation before. The astronomers continue their observations, and what they document becomes increasingly troubling. The celestial cycles, which had always been so predictable, seem to be shifting. Not the sun and moon themselves. Those continue their cycles with mechanical precision. But atmospheric phenomena, the visibility of stars, the appearance of the night sky, the clarity of the air, these are changing. More dust seems to be in the atmosphere. Haze is more common. The stars are less sharp, less clear. The astronomers discuss possibilities. Is there volcanic activity somewhere putting ash into the air? Is there some change in atmospheric conditions? Why is the air becoming hazier? They do not have answers, but they document their observations carefully. And in the careful records they keep, marked in the kivas and on stone tablets, they document the increasing haze, the changing atmosphere, the shifting visibility of celestial objects. What they are observing, though they cannot know it, are the atmospheric effects of climate change. As temperatures rise and drought intensifies, dust from the increasingly exposed, desiccated landscape is being picked up by winds and carried into the atmosphere. Dust storms become more common. Haze becomes more regular. The air itself is changing. As environmental stress increases, the social fabric of the Mesa Verde communities begins to show strain. Incidents of violence increase slightly. Conflicts that would have been resolved through negotiation in times of plenty sometimes escalate into physical confrontation. Theft becomes more common. People stealing stored food, stealing water, stealing valuable items in the hope of trading them elsewhere for resources. The community leadership responds by strengthening enforcement mechanisms. Disputes are mediated more carefully. Punishment for theft becomes more severe. But these responses address symptoms rather than causes. The underlying problem, increasing scarcity and increasing population, remains unresolved. Some families begin to discuss leaving, not openly at first, but in private conversations. My sister married a man from the Rio Grande Valley years ago, someone will mention casually. Perhaps we should reconnect with them. Perhaps there are opportunities there. Perhaps the water situation is better. These conversations remain private. Publicly, people continue to support the community, to participate in ceremonies, to work on projects to improve the water situation. But privately, the question of leaving is beginning to be contemplated by some. By 1250 AD, 20 years of environmental stress have accumulated. The climate has not returned to the abundant conditions of 1200 AD. Water remains scarce. Forests are declining. Harvests are consistently below historic levels. Population remains high, creating pressure on limited resources. The social tensions are palpable. And now, something new begins to emerge. It comes not from Mesa Verde itself, but from surrounding communities. Stories begin to arrive, carried by traders, by travelers, by people passing through, of conflicts breaking out in other regions, competition for water sources, violence over resource access, small conflicts escalating into larger ones. In some areas of the Southwest, the climate stress is apparently pushing communities toward confrontation. As resources become scarcer, communities are fighting each other for access to water, to fertile lands, to controlled territories. The network of trade and exchange that had characterized Pueblo civilization begins to become more militaristic. Stories arrive of fortified settlements, of defensive walls being built, of violence. This news creates alarm in Mesa Verde. The Pueblo peoples here had enjoyed relative peace for centuries. The communities were connected through trade and family relationships, not through warfare. The suggestion that violence was increasing elsewhere sends shivers through the population. Leaders recognize a new danger. If surrounding communities are becoming militaristic, Mesa Verde might need to do the same. But investing resources in defensive infrastructure is expensive. It diverts resources from farming and water management. It means less food production, less water management, less focus on the systems that sustain life. Yet if they do not prepare defenses, and if conflict comes, Mesa Verde would be vulnerable. As 1250 AD closes and 1251 AD begins, the mood in Mesa Verde has shifted profoundly from the confidence of 1200 AD. The future is uncertain, the climate is unstable, resources are stressed, social tensions are rising, conflicts are emerging in neighboring regions, and the population, which had been a source of pride and strength, now feels like a burden, like too many mouths to feed, too many people requiring too little water. A father stands on the mesa top at sunset, looking out over the fields below and the canyon dwellings beyond. His daughter stands beside him, barely aware of the concerns weighing on his mind. He looks at the diminished harvests in the fields. He thinks about the declining water in the cisterns. He thinks about the reports of conflict in neighboring regions. He thinks about the future he will leave for his daughter. Will things be better next year? His daughter asks, with the innocence of childhood. The father cannot answer. In 1200 AD, the answer would have been obvious. Yes, things will continue to be good, as they have always been good. But in 1250 AD, that answer is no longer certain. The future is unclear. For the first time in living memory, the future is not guaranteed. The next few decades will test Mesa Verde in ways the people cannot yet imagine. Climate will continue to deteriorate. The Great Drought, the most severe period in over 2,000 years of climate records, will be approaching. Social tensions will escalate. Difficult decisions will have to be made. And the confident, thriving civilization of 1200 AD will face pressures that will prove nearly impossible to sustain. But that story, the story of the crisis that cannot be resolved, the story of the choice to abandon, that story lies ahead. For now, we leave you in 1250 AD, standing with that father and daughter, looking out at a world that is beginning to change in ways that are deeply troubling. A world that will never be the same. Chapter 4. The Great Drought, When the Sky Closes. History pivots on moments, single moments that change everything. Moments when the trajectory of a civilization shifts from one path to another, from continuation to collapse. For the Pueblo peoples of Mesa Verde, that moment came in the year 1276 AD, a specific year, a specific turning point. In that year, something broke in the climate, something fundamental altered. And from that moment forward, the world would never be the same. What began in 1250 as environmental stress, manageable challenges, difficult but survivable, transforms in 1276 into something far more catastrophic: a megadrought. The most severe drought to strike the Southwest in over 2,000 years of climate records. A drought so intense, so prolonged, so absolutely devastating that it will not break until the year 1299. 23 years of relentless, unbroken aridity. 23 years in which rain becomes almost a memory, a thing that people remember from before, but seems impossible now. 23 years in which the sky itself seems to have turned its back on the Pueblo peoples. This is the story of how a civilization tips from desperation into catastrophe. This is the story of how survival becomes impossible. This is the story of the Great Drought. The year 1276 begins like any other year. Winter has been cold and relatively clear. Spring approaches. The farmers of Mesa Verde prepare the fields, checking their terraces, examining their water channels, preparing for the planting season. They have lived through difficult years. They have learned to be cautious. They have learned to plan conservatively. But they have also survived difficult times before. They believe they will survive this too. Then spring arrives, and the rains do not come. By May, concern transforms into alarm. The soil is dry. Dust covers everything. The springs are barely flowing. The water is at levels lower than even the most pessimistic water specialists had anticipated. The cisterns, which should be being replenished by spring runoff, are instead being depleted as water is released to supplement the non-existent rainfall. An elder water specialist, a man who has managed the water systems for 30 years, stands at the largest cistern. He measures the water level with a long pole, marking the depth with his hand. Then he reaches back into his memory, remembering measurements made years before. The comparison is shocking. "This level," he says to a younger specialist standing beside him, "this level, we have only seen it twice in my lifetime. Once in 1239, once in 1244. Both those years, the rains returned. They returned by late summer." He pauses. "But now it is late May. The rains should have already come. They should have been here for weeks by now." The younger specialist nods. "What do you recommend?" The older man hesitates before answering. In his 30 years, he has never had to answer this question. "We conserve," he finally says. "We reduce agricultural watering. We begin to ration human water consumption, and we pray." By midsummer, it becomes clear that 1276 will be a disaster. The crops, planted in soil too dry to germinate properly, are struggling. Many seeds never sprouted. Of those that did, the plants are stunted, small, clearly distressed. The lack of water is becoming visible. Farmers walking the fields see their life's work withering. The reality is beginning to settle in. This year's harvest will be catastrophically low. Water rationing begins. It is not announced as a crisis measure, but implemented gradually. Water distributions are decreased. People notice. A young mother tries to bathe her child with water rationed for washing, a minimal amount. The child is covered in dust. She is distressed by the dirt, but there is no water to spare for bathing. Gradually, people simply stop trying. Dust becomes normal. Unwashed skin becomes normal. The taste of the water begins to change. As the cisterns are drawn down, water is taken from lower and lower levels, from water that has been stored longer, that has accumulated minerals and sediment. The water becomes slightly bitter, but people drink it. They have no choice. In the kivas, the ceremonies become more intense. Kachina dances, normally performed on specific seasonal dates, now occur with increasing frequency. The religious specialists are trying everything they can think of. Every prayer, every ritual, every invocation. Dancers become exhausted from the constant ceremonies. Young people are initiated into deeper spiritual levels, perhaps in hopes that additional spiritual knowledge will help. Fasting becomes part of ceremonial practice, not as voluntary spiritual discipline, but because there is less food to spare. A young priest stands in a kiva, conducting a ceremony meant to bring rain. He has done this ceremony dozens of times before, but this time is different. This time, as he chants and dances, he feels something he has never felt before: doubt. Deep, troubling doubt. His chants feel hollow. His prayers feel as if they are rising into empty space, unheard, unwanted. The spiritual connection that he had always been able to rely on, the sense that the spirits were listening, that his prayers mattered, seems to have vanished. He pushes the doubt away, forcing himself to continue the ceremony with full commitment. But as he performs the movements, as he chants the words, the doubt remains, lodged in his mind like a stone in his chest. Autumn 1276 brings the harvest. It is a catastrophe. The yield is perhaps 30% of normal. Some fields produce almost nothing. In some cases, the labor invested in preparing the field, planting, and attempting to maintain the crops has not been repaid with any meaningful harvest at all. People gather what little grain they can, but it is not enough. It is far less than what is needed to sustain the population through the winter. The stored reserves from previous years are drawn upon. The corn that had been carefully preserved, grain that represented insurance against exactly this kind of emergency, begins to be consumed. People eat it knowing that once it is gone, it is gone. There is no way to replace it. The emergency reserves are being used up, and they cannot be replenished. Winter 1276-1277 is one of hunger. Not yet starvation, people do not die en masse, but hunger. Real, persistent, daily hunger. People eat smaller portions. Children and the elderly are prioritized to some degree, receiving slightly larger portions. But everyone experiences reduced food intake. Everyone begins to feel the effects: weakness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, increasing susceptibility to illness. A mother watches her child eating a small portion of corn porridge. The portion is less than the child wants. She can see it in the child's face, a desire for more, a hunger not yet satisfied. But there is no more to give. She turns away, unable to watch, unable to bear seeing her child hungry. By spring 1277, the stored reserves are nearly depleted. The population is surviving, but barely. People are thinner. Illnesses that would have been minor inconveniences in times of plenty now become serious problems. An infection that would have resolved on its own becomes dangerous in a malnourished person. A cough becomes pneumonia. A stomach illness becomes life-threatening. The people of Mesa Verde allow themselves a moment of hope in spring 1277. The winter is passing. Spring rains historically should be coming soon. Perhaps they think 1277 will be better. Perhaps the drought of 1276 was an anomaly, a single bad year, not the beginning of a trend. But the rains do not come. By summer 1277, it becomes clear that the drought is continuing. The cisterns are nearly empty. The springs are barely trickling. The emergency water reserves are now being used, the last supplies of backup water being drawn upon. The New Year's crops, already struggling in the dry soil, are receiving minimal water. The agricultural specialists make difficult decisions. Water the fields enough to keep some crops alive, or save the water for human consumption. They choose human consumption. The fields receive minimal water. Most crops fail. The community leadership gathers in the largest kiva to discuss the situation. The tone is tense. People are hungry. Water is scarce. Food stores are depleted. The cisterns are nearly empty. And the drought shows no signs of ending. "We must consider migration," one elder says. The words hang in the air like a curse. Migration. Leaving. Abandoning the cities that have been home for generations. "We cannot abandon our homes," another elder responds. "This is where our ancestors built. This is where our spirits are. But if we stay, we will starve," the first elder counters. "I can see the future, and I see hunger. I see bodies weakening. I see people dying. We cannot survive another year like this." The discussion goes in circles. The water specialists report that the cisterns will be empty by late summer. Once the cisterns are empty, there is no water. No water for drinking, no water for cooking, no water for anything. Without water, the city cannot sustain anyone. "If the rains come," someone suggests hesitantly. "But they will not," the first elder says flatly. "The rains will not come. The sky has closed. The spirits have turned their backs on us. We must face this truth." It is in the midst of this crisis that the stranger arrives. He appears in the canyon one morning, climbing down from the mesa top. He is thin, desperately, visibly thin. His clothes are torn. His feet are wrapped in rags, and blood has soaked through in places where he has walked so far that he has worn through the soles of his feet. People gather around him, curious and cautious. A leader approaches. "Where are you from? What is your name?" The stranger struggles to speak. His throat is dry. Someone brings water, precious water, and allows him to drink. He drinks deeply, desperately. Then slowly, he begins to speak. He is from a pueblo to the north, he explains, a large community similar to Mesa Verde. "But it is gone now," he says. His voice is hollow. "The pueblo is empty. The people are gone or dying." "What happened?" the leader asks. "The drought," the stranger says. 2 years of drought. No rain. No water. The crops failed. The people starved. But worse than starvation, worse was the fighting." He pauses, gathering strength. As food became scarce, as hunger increased, people began to steal. Families stole from neighbors, neighbors from strangers. Men fought over food supplies. And then the warriors came. "Warriors?" the leader asks. "From where?" "From everywhere," the stranger says. "Other pueblos, communities to the south, communities to the east, desperate for food, desperate for resources. They came with weapons. They killed. They took food. They took whatever they could carry. Many people died. He stops, his voice breaking. "I lost my family, my wife, my children. I do not even know. I do not know if they are still alive." He looks at the gathered crowd. "You must leave. You must leave now before the warriors come here, before the hunger becomes so severe that people lose all reason. Go south. Go to where there is still water, still food. Do not stay here. Do not wait. Go now." The crowd stands in stunned silence. The questions that had been abstract, should we leave, can we survive, have suddenly become concrete. The threat is not theoretical. It is real. It is embodied in this broken, desperate man standing before them. The leadership of Mesa Verde gathers again. The appearance of the refugee has changed something. It has made real what had been theoretical. The drought is not just a local phenomenon. It is regional. It is widespread. And it is triggering violence. starvation is combining with warfare to create a situation that is truly catastrophic. If we leave now, one elder argues, we can leave in an organized way. We can carry our most precious items. We can travel to the south, where we have relatives, where we can be received. If we wait, another elder adds, we wait until we are desperate. We wait until we have no food. We wait until the warriors arrive, and then we will have nothing to give. We will be hunted, killed, or enslaved. The decision begins to shift. Not everyone agrees. Some still cling to the hope that the rains will return, that the drought is temporary, that Mesa Verde can be saved. But the weight of evidence, the presence of the refugee, the reality of the cisterns emptying, the grain supplies depleted, all of this begins to create a consensus. We will leave, the head leader announces. But we will leave in an organized way. We will leave according to clan and family. We will appoint guides to lead us south. We will take what we can carry. And we will do this with dignity. The decision is made. Mesa Verde will be abandoned. But the reality of abandonment is far more complex than a simple decision. People have lived their entire lives in these cities. They were born here. Their parents were born here. Their ancestors for generations were born here. The cliff dwellings are not just houses. They are home. They are identity. They are everything. An old woman stands in the kiva where she has conducted ceremonies for 50 years. She looks at the walls, painted with designs created generations ago. She looks at the sacred objects stored here. She understands that she must leave these things. The sacred objects are too precious to leave behind. They must be carried. But the kivas themselves, the painted walls, the carefully engineered spaces, these cannot be carried. They will be abandoned. She sits in the center of the kiva, in the dust beside the cold hearth. She is old. She may not survive the journey south. She knows this. She has already lived longer than most. But still she feels the weight of leaving, the weight of abandonment. A younger priest finds her sitting there. "We must prepare to leave," he says gently. "I know," she responds. "But first I must say goodbye to this place. I must thank the spirits for the years they have allowed us to live here. I must ask them for protection as we journey." She stands slowly and conducts a ceremony. A brief, quiet ceremony, just for herself, just to mark the transition. She sings softly, songs that have been sung in this kiva for generations. And when the ceremony is complete, she closes her eyes for a moment, imprinting the memory of this place in her mind, so that she will carry it with her wherever she goes. Over the next weeks and months, the people of Mesa Verde prepare to leave. It is not a sudden evacuation, but a gradual, organized departure. Families begin to gather their most precious possessions. Not everything, that would be impossible, but items that have special meaning. Family heirlooms, ceremonial objects, records and histories, items that can be carried by a person walking for weeks. Food is prepared for the journey. Whatever surplus grain exists is ground into portable flour. Seeds are collected, seeds of crops that might be replanted wherever the journey ends. Tools are carefully selected. The most important tools are preserved. Others are left behind. The pottery makers face difficult decisions. Pottery cannot be easily transported. The pieces break. So many vessels are left in place. But some pieces, the most beautiful, the most meaningful, the most valuable, are carefully wrapped and packed for the journey. A potter looks at work she spent months creating, work that is beautiful and functional. and then leaves it behind, knowing that no one will ever use it, that it will sit in an abandoned pueblo, slowly deteriorating. Water containers are essential for the journey. Water is scarce everywhere now, not just at Mesa Verde. The journey south will pass through desert. Water containers are prepared. The most reliable, most sturdy containers are selected. Broken ones are left. The people are forced to make calculations. How much water can we carry? Will it be enough to reach a place with water? By the beginning of 1280, Mesa Verde is mostly empty. The last families are preparing to leave. The fields are overgrown. The terraces that required constant maintenance are deteriorating. The agricultural system that had sustained the civilization is now abandoned. The crops that had been carefully tended are no longer planted. The water channels are no longer maintained. Within a few seasons, they will begin to crack and fail. A family stands on the mesa top, looking down at the cliff dwellings below. The structures are empty. The plazas are quiet. The kivas are silent. The sacred fires have been extinguished. The voices of children no longer echo through the canyons. A young father holds the hand of his daughter, the same daughter who, in 1250, had asked if things would be better. Now, in 1280, she is older. She has lived through the hunger. She has seen her younger siblings die of illnesses brought on by malnutrition. She understands at least partially why they are leaving. "Will we come back?" she asks. The father looks down at the abandoned city. He wants to say yes. He wants to believe that someday, when the rains return, when the drought ends, they will return home. But he knows better. He knows that migration at this scale, forced by desperation, usually ends in permanent relocation. "I do not know," he says finally. It is the most honest answer he can give. They turn and begin to walk south, joining the long line of people. Thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, who are leaving Mesa Verde. The cliff dwellings empty. The terraces crumble. The cisterns dry up completely. The kivas begin to deteriorate as water and weather slowly damage the carefully painted walls and stone structures. But some people do not leave. Or they leave later, after years of trying to survive in the increasingly empty city. A few families remain at Mesa Verde even as late as 1285, perhaps hoping that the rains will return, perhaps unable to make the decision to leave, perhaps too old or weak to undertake the journey south. What they experience is progressive deterioration. The system that had sustained civilization is failing. The water is gone. The stored food is gone. The population is so depleted that community structures break down. The ceremonies that had held the society together no longer occur because there are too few people to conduct them. Without ceremonies, without the spiritual and social structures that bound people together, what remains is just individuals trying to survive. Eventually, even these last residents leave. They pack whatever they can carry and join the southern migration. Some probably perish on the journey, too weak to complete the crossing of the desert. Some probably reach the Rio Grande Valley or southern Arizona and integrate into the Pueblo communities that still exist there. By 1285 AD, Mesa Verde is completely abandoned. Not a single permanent resident remains. The population of tens of thousands has migrated south. The cities that had been thriving centers of civilization just 5 years before are now silent, empty, abandoned. The cliff dwellings, so carefully constructed, so precisely engineered, so beautifully decorated, now sit vacant. Wind blows through the open doorways. Rain, when it does fall, and it falls rarely during the drought years, enters the structures through openings. dust accumulates on the stone floors. Rocks loosen from walls as mortar, no longer maintained, begins to deteriorate. In the kivas, the sacred spaces sit dark and empty. The hearths where ceremonial fires once burned are cold. The painted walls, so carefully maintained, begin to weather. The sipapu, the emergence place that held such spiritual significance, is now just a hole in the ground in an empty chamber. The fields on the mesa top are overgrown. The terraces that required constant maintenance begin to crumble. The water channels break and become impassable. The agricultural system that had transformed an arid landscape into productive farmland collapses. Within a few years, the landscape looks as if human civilization had never existed there. Just stone structures remaining. Monuments to a people who had learned to master an impossible environment and then had been forced to abandon it. This is the moment we have been building toward. This is the catastrophe that makes abandonment not just possible, but necessary. This is the great drought, the mega drought, that defines the end of the ancestral Puebloan presence in the Four Corners region. When the Spanish explorers arrived in the southwest centuries later, they found these empty cliff dwellings and had no explanation for why such magnificent structures had been abandoned. They could not imagine that an entire civilization could simply leave its greatest achievements behind. They could not imagine that humans, faced with environmental catastrophe, would choose relocation over death. But the people of Mesa Verde had made that choice. When the drought became unlivable, when the cisterns ran dry, when stored food was depleted, when the rains ceased to fall for year after year, when neighboring communities began to attack out of desperation, the people of Mesa Verde chose to survive. They chose to migrate. They chose to abandon their cities and their sacred spaces and their ancestral homes because survival itself had become the only priority that mattered. In 1280 AD, one of the greatest civilizations in North America made a collective decision to abandon everything and start over elsewhere. It was not a decision made lightly. It was not a decision anyone wanted to make, but it was the only decision that made sense. The only way forward when the world had changed so fundamentally that the old world could no longer sustain life. Next, in our final chapter, we will follow the refugees as they journey south. We will explore what they found when they arrived. We will investigate what happened to the most precious artifacts, the objects that were carried out of Mesa Verde and lost to history. And we will discover what ultimately happened to these artifacts, how some were lost forever, taken by treasure hunters in the 1800s, and how this loss represents not just the disappearance of beautiful objects, but the erasure of cultural memory, of history, of identity. But for now, we stand in the silence of 1285 AD. The cities are empty. The civilization has been abandoned. The people have chosen survival over home. Chapter 5. Artifacts lost, memory erased. The story of Mesa Verde does not end in 1285 AD. The cities were abandoned. The people left. But the cities did not disappear. The structures remained, standing in the canyons, silent and empty, preserving within them the final moments of a civilization. For nearly 600 years, these buildings stood undisturbed, holding within them objects and records of the people who had lived there. These objects, pottery, tools, textiles, sacred items, represented not just physical artifacts, but the memory of a culture, the knowledge of a people, the evidence of how humans had learned to survive in an impossible environment. And then, in the year 1888, that preservation ended. In December of that year, two cowboys pursuing cattle through the canyons of Mesa Verde stumbled upon Cliff Palace. They were ranchers named Richard Wetherill and Charles Mason. They had no idea what they had found. They had no understanding of the significance of the structures before them. They only knew that these buildings contained objects that might be valuable, objects that could be sold. What happened next is one of the great tragedies of American archaeology. A story of looting, of commercialism, of cultural destruction. A story of how priceless artifacts, objects that could have told us so much about how the Pueblo peoples lived, were scattered across the world, sold to private collectors, institutions, and museums, ultimately lost to the people to whom they belonged. This is the story of what happened to Mesa Verde's treasures. This is the story of how memory itself was stolen. That December day in 1888, when Wetherill and Mason first saw Cliff Palace, must have been astonishing. For centuries, the structures had sat undisturbed in the canyon. Wind had weathered the stones, rain had penetrated some structures, but on the whole, the buildings had been preserved almost intact. The rooms still contained pottery. The kivas still held sacred objects. The plazas were empty, but the structures that surrounded them remained. Wetherill and Mason reported their discovery. Word spread. Before long, archaeologists, historians, and collectors began arriving at Mesa Verde. Initially, some efforts were made to conduct what we would now call scientific excavation, careful documentation, measurement, recording of context. But these efforts were sporadic, inconsistent, and often subordinated to commercial interests. By the 1890s, the situation had deteriorated. What began as archaeological investigation transformed into something closer to looting. Richard Wetherill, who had discovered Cliff Palace, began conducting excavations that were explicitly commercial in nature. He was not interested primarily in understanding the past. He was interested in recovering objects that could be sold for profit. In 1892, Wetherill assembled a massive collection of artifacts, pottery, textiles, tools, sacred objects, from various Mesa Verde sites. These objects were collected from cliff dwellings, from kivas, from storage rooms. A Swedish collector named Gustav Nordenskjöld arrived at Mesa Verde, and working with Wetherill, assembled an additional enormous collection. Nordenskjöld alone removed more than 600 artifacts from the site, including human remains. By 1906, when the U.S. government finally passed the Antiquities Act, legislation that made unauthorized excavation of archaeological sites on public lands illegal, thousands of artifacts had already been removed from Mesa Verde. The damage had been done. The archaeological context had been destroyed. The record of where objects had been found, what they had been near, what they had been associated with, all of this had been lost or carelessly recorded. To understand what this meant, you must understand the difference between an artifact in context and an artifact without context. An artifact in context, a pottery vessel found in a specific room, associated with other objects, with evidence of use and placement, tells a story. That vessel, associated with corn stored in the same room, tells you something about storage practices. That vessel, decorated with specific patterns, tells you something about artistic traditions. That vessel, found with wear patterns suggesting use, tells you something about how it was employed. But a pottery vessel removed from its context, taken from the room and separated from everything around it, becomes just an object. Beautiful, perhaps. Historically interesting, maybe. but it no longer tells its full story. Archaeologists call this context loss, and it is among the greatest tragedies in archaeology, worse in some ways than destruction, because the object is preserved physically, but its meaning is destroyed. The pottery from Mesa Verde is particularly significant. The black-on-white decorated wares produced there during the height of the civilization were among the most beautiful and technically sophisticated pottery produced in pre-Columbian North America. The designs are geometric, precise, often abstract, but clearly meaningful to the people who created them. Individual potters developed recognizable styles. Some vessels contain hundreds of individual design elements, each one carefully placed, suggesting meticulous craftsmanship and sophisticated artistic understanding. But when these vessels were looted from the cliff dwellings and scattered to private collectors and museums around the world, the context that made them truly valuable was lost. Which room was that vessel found in? Was it used for storage, for water, for ceremonial purposes? Who made it? Was it a family member, a specialist potter? What do the designs mean? Are they astronomical symbols? Spiritual representations? Simple aesthetic choices? Without the context, these questions become unanswerable. Beyond pottery, other objects were removed. Textiles, woven fabrics of extraordinary delicacy and sophistication, were taken. These textiles represent technology and artistic achievement. They suggest knowledge of dye production, weaving techniques, pattern design. But separated from context, we do not know if they were everyday garments or ceremonial wear. We do not know if they were woven for specific families or for communal use. We do not know who created them or what they meant. Tools were removed. Stone implements, bone tools, wooden items. These objects tell stories about daily life, about the work that people did, about the technology they employed. But again, without context, the stories are incomplete. Sacred objects were removed, kachina masks, prayer sticks, ceremonial items whose meaning was sacred to the Pueblo peoples. These objects, taken from the kivas where they had been used in ceremonies, were treated as curios by their captors, displayed in museums and private collections as interesting historical items, without any understanding of their spiritual significance. And human remains were removed. The bones of ancestors were excavated, examined, measured, catalogued, and stored in museum collections. To the Pueblo peoples, this was a form of violation. To them, the remains of their ancestors are sacred. They should not be disturbed. They should not be examined by outsiders. They should certainly not be stored in museum warehouses, treated as specimens for scientific study. What makes the tragedy of Mesa Verde's artifacts worse is what happened to them after removal. They were not preserved in a single location, accessible to researchers and to the Pueblo peoples themselves. Rather, they were scattered. Collections were assembled by individual collectors and sold to the highest bidder. Museums acquired them. Private collectors purchased them. Over time, pieces that had been removed from the same site, even from the same building, ended up in different institutions in different cities. A pottery vessel looted from Cliff Palace ended up in a museum in the eastern United States. A textile from the same site was purchased by a private collector in Europe. Human remains from a kiva were examined by an anthropologist and then stored in a museum warehouse. A kachina mask was sold to a private collector who kept it in their home. Tracking down where all these objects ended up became nearly impossible. Some pieces are documented. Many are not. Museums have records of their collections, but the records are often incomplete, sometimes contradictory. private collectors, particularly those who purchased artifacts decades ago, sometimes did not keep records at all. Some artifacts have been lost completely, purchased by individuals, kept for decades, and then disposed of when the collector died. No photographs, no documentation, just gone. The Swedish collector, Gustaf Nordenskjöld, shipped his collection back to Europe. It ended up in the National Museum of Finland, where it remains to this day. Over 600 pieces, pottery, textiles, tools, and human remains, housed in a museum in Helsinki, Finland, thousands of miles from their origin. To the Pueblo peoples, these objects represent their heritage, their history, their ancestors, yet they sit in a museum on another continent, managed by people who have no cultural connection to them, studied occasionally by researchers with academic interests. But the loss of Mesa Verde's artifacts is not just an abstract tragedy of lost context and dispersed collections. It is a personal tragedy for the Pueblo peoples. The artifacts represent ancestors, they represent cultural knowledge, they represent identity. Imagine being a descendant of the people who abandoned Mesa Verde. Imagine that your people have a traditional homeland, a place where your ancestors lived, where they built magnificent cities, where they developed sophisticated technologies and beautiful art. Imagine that this place is accessible. You can still visit it. You can walk through the cliff dwellings. You can see where your ancestors lived. You can feel the presence of your heritage. But imagine that the objects your ancestors made, the pottery, the textiles, the tools, the sacred items, are gone. They have been removed and scattered. Some are in museums far away. Some are in private homes. Some have been lost completely. Your connection to this material heritage has been severed. A Pueblo elder stands in an abandoned kiva at Mesa Verde, in the place where sacred ceremonies were conducted for generations. The kiva is empty. The sacred objects that should be here are gone. They were taken centuries ago and scattered across the country and the world. The elder knows approximately where some of them are, in museums, in collections, but many have been lost. Many are untraceable. The elder sits in the dust of the ancient kiva and weeps, not because the buildings are gone. The buildings can be understood through context and memory, but because the objects, the material evidence of the people who lived here, who created here, who worshipped here, are gone, scattered, lost to the people to whom they belong. The destruction of context has had profound scientific consequences. Archaeologists and historians studying Mesa Verde have been severely hampered by the looting. If the artifacts had been preserved in situ, carefully excavated and documented, the understanding we could have achieved would be far greater. Consider a hypothetical scenario. A pottery vessel found in a storage room in Cliff Palace, associated with stored corn, with evidence of use as a container. That vessel, in context, tells us something about food storage practices. The design of the vessel, its shape, its size, its decoration, is relevant. The materials used to make it, the clay, the pigments, are relevant. The location where it was found, with similar vessels, with tools, with organic remains, is relevant. But a pottery vessel looted from that same room and sold to a private collector tells us much less. We know it is beautiful. We can study its artistic qualities. We can analyze the materials if we have access to the vessel. But we do not know what it was used for. We do not know how old it is precisely. We do not know if it is typical of Mesa Verde production or exceptional. We do not know the cultural or social significance it held. Multiply this across thousands of artifacts, and you begin to understand the scale of the scientific loss. Entire categories of information are simply inaccessible because the context has been destroyed. Moreover, the looting prevented systematic excavation. If the sites had been carefully and systematically excavated by archaeologists, we would have comprehensive knowledge of the site. But because looting was chaotic and focused on collecting valuable or interesting objects, large portions of the sites were never documented. Empty rooms that contained no obvious artifacts were never carefully examined. Areas without preserved structures were never investigated. The piecemeal removal of objects prevented the kind of systematic understanding that comes from complete site investigation. The slow return. In recent decades, efforts have begun to address some of this tragedy. Museums and private collectors, responding to both legal pressure and ethical considerations, have begun to return artifacts to the Pueblo peoples. The Antiquities Act of 1906 finally made unauthorized excavation illegal. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, of 1990, required federally funded institutions to return Native American cultural items, including human remains, to the tribes to which they belong. These laws have begun to result in repatriations. Objects that were looted decades ago are beginning to be returned to the Pueblo communities. Human remains are being reburied. Sacred objects are being returned to those who understand their significance. But the process is slow and incomplete. Many artifacts are still in museums, still cataloged as part of collections, still awaiting repatriation decisions. Some private collectors have refused to return items, citing legal ownership. Some artifacts remain untraced. No one knows where they are. Some have simply been lost to history. A ceremony takes place at Mesa Verde. Pueblo peoples from the surrounding communities have gathered. Archaeological officials are present. A collection of artifacts, pottery vessels, stone tools, textiles, has been carefully transported from a museum hundreds of miles away. These objects are being returned home. They are being brought back to the place where they were made, where they were used, where they were abandoned. The ceremony is bittersweet. On one hand, there is joy. The ancestors' creations are returning. The material culture of the people is being restored to them. On the other hand, there is sadness. 600 years have passed. Most of the objects are not being returned to the places they were found. That context is lost. Many objects remain scattered in distant museums and private collections. The return is partial. It is incomplete. It cannot undo the damage of centuries of looting. What could have been known? If Mesa Verde had been carefully and systematically excavated, if artifacts had been recovered and recorded with attention to context, if the site had been treated as a scientific resource rather than as a source of valuable objects, the understanding we could have achieved would be profound. We could have understood in detail how the Pueblo peoples organized their society. We could have traced the evolution of their pottery styles across centuries. We could have understood their religious practices through examination of kivas and sacred objects in context. We could have understood their agricultural practices through examination of tools and storage systems. We could have understood their trade networks through analysis of exotic materials. We could have understood how they responded to environmental stress and social pressure. We could have learned so much. But instead, because the sites were looted, because context was destroyed, because scientific excavation was prevented, much of that knowledge is lost forever. The story of Mesa Verde's artifacts carries a lesson that extends beyond archaeology. It is a lesson about cultural respect. It is a lesson about the difference between preservation and plundering. It is a lesson about how human greed and disregard for cultural significance can destroy knowledge and meaning. When Richard Wetherill and his associates looted Mesa Verde, they were not deliberately trying to harm the Pueblo peoples or destroy cultural knowledge. They were opportunistically extracting value from what they saw as abandoned ruins. They were operating within a cultural context where such extraction was seen as acceptable, even admirable. Wetherill became famous as the discoverer of Cliff Palace. Museums competed for his collections. Private collectors bid for his artifacts. He became wealthy and celebrated. But the cost of this wealth and fame was paid by the Pueblo peoples. It was paid in lost cultural heritage. It was paid in spiritual desecration. It was paid in the removal of ancestors' remains. It was paid in the scattering of artifacts across the globe, severing the connection between objects and the people who made them. Today, visitors can walk through the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. The structures are preserved. The engineered systems are still visible. The scale and sophistication of the construction is evident. Visitors can understand something of how the people lived. Guides can explain the theories about why the people left. But the objects are mostly gone. The kivas are empty. The rooms contain no pottery, no tools, no evidence of daily life. The material culture that would bring the site to life has been removed. Visitors see impressive architecture, but limited evidence of the people who inhabited it. The site has been filled in somewhat. Modern archaeologists have been more careful than the looters. In recent years, some artifacts have been replaced in museum displays, specifically designed to show how objects would have appeared in their original context. Some repatriated objects have been returned and are managed by the Pueblo peoples themselves. But much is still missing. A modern visitor stands in Cliff Palace, trying to imagine what it was like in 1200 AD. The guide points out the structures, rooms, kivas, storage areas. The visitor tries to picture people living here, going about daily life, creating and using the objects that once filled these spaces. But without the material evidence, the imaginative leap is difficult. The site, stripped of its artifacts, is less fully able to speak its story. This, then, is the final chapter of Mesa Verde's story. Not the story of abandonment that happened in 1285, but the story of what happened afterward. For nearly 600 years, the cliff dwellings preserved their mysteries, their artifacts, their evidence, and then in 1888 that preservation ended. Commercial looting began, artifacts were removed, context was destroyed, knowledge was lost. The tragedy is that we will never know all that might have been learned from a careful, systematic excavation of Mesa Verde. We will never know the full extent of the Pueblo people's knowledge, their artistic sophistication, their social organization, their spiritual practices. That knowledge has been partially lost, scattered across distant museums and private collections, sometimes inaccessible even to those who should have greatest access to it, the descendant communities. Yet there is hope. In recent decades, attitudes have changed. Laws have been passed. Efforts are being made to repatriate artifacts. The Pueblo peoples are reclaiming their heritage. Knowledge is being gathered and preserved. Archaeological practices have changed. Modern investigations are conducted with careful attention to context and with respect for cultural significance. The cities of Mesa Verde, abandoned in 1285 AD, remain standing. They are not fully empty anymore. People visit them. Guides share their stories. The Pueblo peoples return to them, reconnecting with their ancestors' achievements. And slowly, artifact by artifact, the material culture that was scattered is beginning to return home. The final message of Mesa Verde is complex. It is a message of human achievement, the ability of people to build magnificent cities, to engineer water systems, to create beautiful art, to sustain a civilization in a harsh environment. It is a message of human vulnerability, the reality that even sophisticated civilizations can be overwhelmed by environmental stress. It is a message of cultural resilience, the fact that even after abandonment, even after centuries of separation, the Pueblo peoples endure, maintaining their cultural identity and reclaiming their heritage. But it is also a message of loss of knowledge, loss of cultural connection, loss of memory, loss that could have been prevented if greed had not overwhelmed respect, loss that serves as a warning to us. The past is precious. Cultural heritage is irreplaceable. Context is everything. And once destroyed, the meaning of history cannot always be recovered. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde stand as monuments not just to the civilization that abandoned them, but to everything we have lost through carelessness, greed, and disrespect. They remind us of what we should have learned. They remind us of what we may never know. And they challenge us to do better, to treat cultural heritage with the respect it deserves, to preserve context and meaning, to ensure that the material culture of peoples does not become separated from the peoples themselves. The story of Mesa Verde is not just a story of abandonment. It is a story of loss, of tragedy, of wisdom born from mistakes. It is a story that continues to this day, as pieces of the puzzle continue to be restored, as knowledge continues to be recovered, as the Pueblo peoples continue to reclaim the heritage that was taken from them. And perhaps someday enough pieces will be gathered, enough context will be restored, enough knowledge will be recovered, that we will finally be able to hear the full voice of Mesa Verde, speaking across the centuries. Not the voice of an abandoned city, but the voice of a living, thriving civilization, telling us of their achievements, their struggles, their wisdom, their humanity. That day has not come yet, but it approaches.